I never thought I'd notice the quiet things so much. The way sunlight bounced off the chipped counter, or how the smell of motor oil mixed with coffee made the air feel strangely alive. But that morning, everything felt sharper, somehow. I'd just opened the repair shop, and she was there, standing in the doorway like she owned the space, though she'd only ever been a visitor. Her name was Evelyn, mid-40s, but she carried it differently than anyone I'd ever known. Confidence wasn't loud with her. It was the subtle tilt of her head, the measured way she crossed her arms, or the soft line of her lips that hinted at secrets she'd never tell. She had that ease, like she didn't need anyone to validate her presence. Yet somehow, when she spoke, the room shifted just enough to make me stumble over my own words. I was wiping down a bench when she leaned slightly against the counter, scanning the tools, her fingers brushing a wrench absent-mindedly. She glanced at me, longer than necessary, and I almost imagined she could see past the grease stains and the nervous tightness in my shoulders. My voice caught before I could even say morning, so I just nodded. She smiled, quick, almost apologetic, like she hadn't meant to make me feel exposed. It was awkward. That's the word I kept circling in my head all morning. She said something about her sister being stuck in traffic, and I realized the whole day had suddenly pivoted. Her sister, my girlfriend's sister, had decided to drop by instead of her usual schedule, and somehow, Evelyn had just appeared in that moment. No explanation needed, no dramatic entrance, just her, filling the air between us without even trying. I caught myself watching the way she moved around the shop, careful, deliberate, brushing against shelves as if testing the weight of the world she carried on her own. When she picked up a rag and wiped down the counter I'd been cleaning, I felt a weird jolt. Not the spark of a fling, not the recklessness of a crush, but the quiet electricity of someone noticing the smallest corners of your life. My hands itched to do something, anything, but I froze. We fell into silence for a moment. Just the two of us, the hum of fluorescent lights overhead, and a faint creak from the door as it swayed in the morning draft. I wanted to ask her something, anything, but the words kept slipping away. So instead, I watched. She tilted her head, catching a smudge I'd missed on the bench, and brushed it off with a casual grace that made my chest tighten. I caught a fleeting glance in the mirror behind the counter. She'd looked back at me at the same time. Our eyes held for a second longer than polite, and I swear I felt her hesitate, just slightly, before turning away. That pause, the one where nothing was said, stayed with me. It lingered in the light, in the smell of the shop, in the quiet rhythm of our breathing. I didn't know what it meant, but I couldn't stop thinking about it, even as she straightened up and said, "I guess I'll wait for her here," like it was nothing at all. The shop smelled faintly of oil and dust that morning, but when Evelyn arrived again, this time carrying a box of tools she claimed she needed for a friend, the air seemed to change. I was under a car, hands grimy, and the sound of her shoes against the concrete floor made me pause mid-turn, wrench in hand. She didn't speak at first, just set the box down carefully and leaned against the wall, arms folded, eyes scanning the shelves like she was cataloging a museum she didn't trust. There was a distance there, a quiet wall she'd built without asking permission, and I felt the pull of it immediately, wanting to cross it, but knowing she might recoil if I tried too fast. "Do you need help with that?" I asked, voice low, not wanting to startle her. Her laugh was soft, almost a sigh, and it made me freeze. Not the laugh that fills a room, but the one that comes out in private, when you let yourself forget someone's watching. She hesitated before answering, twisting the ring on her finger, a subtle, nervous gesture, and then shook her head. "I've got it, I think." But I saw it. The tiny tremble in her hands as she reached for a wrench, the way her shoulders stiffened, the faint tension around her eyes. She tried to mask it with a casual shrug, but I didn't miss the vulnerability hiding beneath her calm exterior. I moved closer, offering a hand with a socket she couldn't quite reach, and our fingers brushed. It was brief, almost accidental, yet it carried weight. She looked at me then, just long enough for a flicker of something to pass through her. Hesitation, curiosity, maybe recognition that the world outside this shop didn't have to be entirely hers to control. "You're careful," I said, almost reflexively, trying to fill the silence. She raised an eyebrow, lips twitching with that small, knowing smile that somehow always seemed like she was both mocking and forgiving me at once. "I try to be," she replied, voice quiet, and I noticed how tired it sounded. Not physically, but the kind of weariness that comes from holding yourself together too long, from carrying more than you let anyone see. We moved around the car together, our motions sinking without conversation. She paused, a hand on the hood, looking down at the tools as if deciding whether she could trust me to actually help. The vulnerability in that hesitation made my chest tighten. I wanted to reach out, to say something comforting, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I simply handed her the socket she needed, and our fingers brushed again. This time, it lingered just a heartbeat longer, electric enough to make me swallow. Her laugh returned, softer now, and it felt like a small confession. Something private, fragile. "Thanks," she said, barely audible, and for a second, the shop felt smaller, warmer, like it was holding us in a bubble we hadn't earned. We stood there, just a little too close, breathing in the same quiet, watching the sunlight fall across the dust motes in the air. Her gaze flicked up, met mine, and I could tell she wanted to say something. Something she wasn't ready to admit, maybe even to herself. The world outside the shop seemed to vanish. All I could notice was the gentle rise and fall of her shoulders, the subtle tension in her hands, and the quiet charge lingering between us, unspoken but undeniable. And I knew, somehow, that this moment, small, delicate, dangerous, was only the beginning. The rain tapped steadily against the windows of the small cafe, a dull rhythm that made everything inside feel both intimate and suspended. Evelyn and I had ended up there almost by accident. She ducked in to escape the sudden storm, and I followed, partly out of habit, partly because I couldn't quite leave her alone. We sat across from each other, the table cluttered with steaming mugs, our knees brushing under the tabletop in a way neither of us acknowledged. I kept my hands wrapped around my cup, trying to keep my voice steady, but inside, everything was fraying a little. There was something in the way she laughed quietly at a story she didn't tell, a pause that lingered too long, that made my chest tighten. "You never ask much about yourself," I said finally, voice low, careful. Her gaze drifted to the window, watching raindrops race each other down the glass. She smiled faintly, not at me, but at something only she could see. "I don't think it matters," she said. Her words hit me, not with anger or offense, but with a strange, pulling ache. I wanted to argue, to tell her that it did matter, that it mattered to me, but the sound of her voice, so soft, so deliberate, kept me from moving too fast. The cafe door opened suddenly, letting in a gust of wind and a stray drop of rain. She flinched slightly, and for a moment, our eyes met, longer than a polite glance, shorter than confession. The air between us felt taut, like a string pulled just to the edge. I wanted to reach across the table, to brush a lock of damp hair from her face, but I didn't. I stayed still, because some invisible rule whispered that moving too fast would break everything. Then her phone buzzed, an unknown number, and she glanced at it, hesitation flashing across her features. I didn't ask who it was. I didn't need to. Something in that pause, in the subtle tightening of her fingers around the phone, said more than words ever could. She silenced it, slipped it into her bag without answering, and I realized how carefully she guarded even the smallest pieces of herself. We returned to awkward conversation, half-finished sentences, topics we abandoned mid-thought, laughter that felt both genuine and tentative. The storm outside framed the silence, punctuating it with its own rhythm, and I noticed the small things. The way her hand rested on the table, the subtle lift of her eyebrows, the tiny quiver in her smile that made me want to lean in and hold her in a way I knew I couldn't. Our knees brushed again. This time, the contact lingered a heartbeat longer. I could feel the warmth, the weight of it, and my chest ached with restraint. Part of me wanted to lean forward, to close the gap between us, to see if the electricity humming in the air was real. But another part, a quiet, stubborn part, kept me anchored, watching, waiting, and silently begging her not to pull away. The moment stretched, suspended between desire and hesitation. I saw the almost confession in her eyes, the unspoken question hovering there like a candle flame. I wanted to answer it, to act, to finally bridge the space that had grown so intimate, so charged. But the world outside the table, with its storm and rules and obligations, held us back. And so we stayed like that, on the edge, both of us aware, neither of us moving, hearts quietly racing, waiting for the storm to end. The repair shop was quiet that evening, empty except for the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. I had been cleaning up a corner, sorting through tools I barely needed, when she leaned against the doorway. Evelyn's shadow stretched across the floor, tall and contained, but I could see it quivering slightly, like the calm she always wore was starting to crack. We didn't speak at first, not because there was nothing to say, but because everything felt too fragile to put into words. The kind of tension that had been simmering between us for weeks now pressed into the room, and even the clink of a wrench on the bench sounded too loud. Finally, she spoke, voice low, hesitant. "Do you ever think about what this is?" I froze mid-motion, hands hovering over a socket. Her question was simple, almost casual, but it carried weight, a slow, creeping gravity that pulled at something inside me. I didn't answer right away, just watched her. She wasn't defensive or confrontational, just raw, vulnerable in a way I hadn't seen before. "I mean us," she added, shifting slightly, fingers brushing the edge of the counter. Her hands looked tired, delicate, even in the harsh light of the shop. I don't know why it feels like this sometimes." I swallowed hard. My chest tightened, and I wanted to reach out, to reassure her, to say something that might anchor her in the confusion, but I couldn't. Not yet. Instead, I just nodded slowly, letting the silence speak, letting the air between us carry the things we couldn't say. She stepped closer, and I noticed everything. The way her shoulders sloped just a little, the slight tremor of her hands, the way her eyes caught mine and held on for too long. My pulse sped up, not with desire, but with the weight of recognition. We were standing on the edge of something neither of us had a map for. "What are we doing?" she whispered finally, almost to herself, almost as if she was asking the question of the empty shop. But her gaze found me, and I realized it was directed at me entirely. The words weren't romantic, weren't flirtatious. They were existential, trembling with a raw honesty that made me want to sink into them and hide at the same time. I opened my mouth to speak, to offer some kind of guidance, but the words faltered. Everything I could say sounded insufficient, clumsy, incapable of holding the gravity of her eyes. So I stayed silent, letting the quiet stretch and thrum between us, a pressure we could neither release nor ignore. She shifted again, closer, and for a moment, I thought she might collapse into words, might confess, might cry. But instead, she leaned her forehead against the counter, shoulders slumping, and let out a long, almost imperceptible sigh. "I don't know if I should even be here," she admitted finally, barely audible, as if saying it out loud made it more real. Her voice cracked just slightly, and I could see the vulnerability she tried so hard to hide every other day. And in that quiet, still space, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to before. Neither of us could pretend anymore. Something had shifted. The tension, the unspoken electricity, the moments we thought were harmless. All of it was real. And it was terrifying. She lifted her head just a fraction, eyes glimmering, voice trembling. "I'm scared I'm going to ruin this." I had just turned the corner of the shop to grab a new set of wrenches when Evelyn's voice stopped me. "Can I show you something?" She held a faded envelope in her hand, edges frayed, the kind that smelled faintly of old paper and time. She didn't meet my eyes at first, just traced the corner with her thumb, like it carried some weight she wasn't ready to lift alone. "What is it?" I asked gently, careful not to make her feel pressured. She swallowed, finally looking up at me, and I caught the hesitation, the way her lips pressed together, the quick blink of her eyes that said she was holding back more than just words. Something from a long time ago, before everything. She opened the envelope slowly, revealing a single photograph tucked inside. It was old, faded at the edges, showing a younger version of herself laughing with someone I didn't recognize at first. Then I realized, the way her fingers lingered over the photo, the softness in her gaze. It was someone she had loved and lost. I don't talk about him much, she admitted, voice barely above the hum of the shop lights. It didn't end well. And somehow, I thought I could forget, but her hands trembled slightly, brushing over the photo like she was afraid it might crumble beneath her touch. I didn't say anything right away. I just watched, noticing the subtle tension in her shoulders, the tightness around her jaw, the faint moisture in her eyes. Her vulnerability made my chest ache, not with desire, but with the quiet longing to hold the weight she carried, to make the unspoken lighter for her. I was young, she continued, voice catching, and foolish. I thought I had forever. I didn't. And she swallowed, a pause stretching between us like the quiet before a storm. I never told anyone. I wanted to reach across the counter, to touch her hand, but I stopped myself. Not out of restraint, though that was part of it, but because I knew this moment wasn't about me. It was about her, and about the fragile, raw honesty she was offering without apology. For a moment, we just sat there, the photograph between us, heavy with memory. The shop felt smaller, warmer, intimate in a way that made the world outside feel distant. I noticed the small things again, the faint scent of her perfume, the tremble in her hands, the quiet strength in the way she kept her gaze steady despite the quiver in her voice. I didn't think anyone would understand, she whispered, almost to herself. You're not alone, I said softly, the words feeling heavier than I expected. Her eyes flicked up, and there it was, a glimmer of trust, a fragile connection, as if she'd just tested the waters and found me willing to stay. The photograph rested between us, a symbol of past heartbreak, of loss, of everything she had buried, and yet somehow, it was also a bridge, a quiet acknowledgement that maybe some weight could be shared. She tucked the photo back into the envelope, lingering over it with her fingers. And when she finally let it go, placing it on the counter, her gaze met mine in a way that was both tentative and searing. I could see the shift in her, subtle but undeniable. Something inside had moved. And as she stepped back, just slightly, the soft exhale of her breath brushing against my shoulder, I realized that everything we'd been dancing around, the tension, the restraint, the quiet pull, had changed. For the first time, it wasn't just a spark. It was a quiet earthquake beneath the surface, waiting for permission to grow. The shop was quiet that evening, except for the low hum of the lights and the faint creak of the floorboards beneath our feet. I was organizing tools again, though my movements felt mechanical, distracted. Evelyn was leaning against the counter, arms folded loosely, eyes tracing the outlines of the shelves. The air between us felt heavy, but not in a suffocating way, more like it was holding something fragile, waiting for acknowledgement. She broke the silence first, voice soft, careful. I've been thinking, she said, fingers brushing the edge of the counter absent-mindedly. About everything. About how we ended up here. I didn't respond immediately. My chest tightened at the words, not with expectation or anticipation, but with the awareness that she was letting me in, gently, without forcing the moment. I moved closer, staying just within reach, careful not to crowd her. I don't know what this means, she continued, her gaze dropping to the floor. Not exactly, but it feels wrong to pretend it's nothing. I nodded, letting the silence fill the space between her words. The truth was there, unspoken but undeniable. We both knew that whatever this was, whatever pull had been simmering between us for weeks, had already shifted. It wasn't a sudden flame, it was quiet, persistent, impossible to ignore. She glanced up at me, a faint tremor in her lips, and for a moment, everything else disappeared. The tools, the shop, the hum of the lights. I wanted to say something profound, something that might name it all, but I realized we didn't need words. Not yet. Not like this. Her hand brushed against mine as she shifted slightly, fingers grazing, lingering just long enough to make my pulse hitch. I didn't pull away. Instead, I let my hand rest near hers, feeling the warmth, the tentative connection, the unspoken acknowledgement of everything that had led us here. We moved through the space together slowly, naturally, like we had always belonged there, not as a sudden romance, but as two people who had been orbiting each other until the quiet gravity of circumstance finally allowed us to meet. We didn't need to define it. We didn't need to name it. The weight of shared understanding, the acknowledgement of weeks of tension and small gestures, said more than words ever could. Finally, she leaned her forehead against the counter, her hand brushing against mine again, softer this time. I stayed still, letting her find her own balance, letting the quiet settle over us like a soft blanket. It was intimate without being dramatic, decisive without needing speech. And then we just sat there, side by side, hands almost touching, breathing in the same slow rhythm. No declarations, no promises, just recognition, shared space, and the gentle inevitability of what had grown between us. For the first time, the pull, the tension, the quiet ache of unspoken emotion felt settled, not resolved in words, but in presence, in the simple act of being near each other, of letting the other exist in the same space without pretense. And in that moment, I understood something fundamental. Some connections aren't about fireworks or grand gestures. They're about quiet certainty, earned through patience, observation, and the slow unfolding of trust. She shifted slightly, brushing her fingers against mine again, and I knew, without needing to speak, that we had crossed a line that could never be undone. It's strange how some moments stay with you, not in flashes of drama or fireworks, but in quiet, almost imperceptible ways. I still remember the way Evelyn's hand brushed mine that evening in the shop, the soft shift of her weight as she leaned against the counter, and the unspoken understanding that neither of us needed to name what had grown between us. Life hasn't been perfect since then. I still get grease under my nails, and she still carries the quiet weight of her past, the heartbreak she shared in fragments, the lingering hesitation that never fully disappears. But the air between us is different now, lighter, warmer, something earned through patience and observation, through noticing the smallest gestures and trusting that the other would notice too. I've changed too. I pay closer attention, linger longer in conversations, and notice the subtleties in someone's presence, the tilt of a head, the pause before a word, the little tremor in a hand. Evelyn taught me that love isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the space you share without needing to speak, the way someone's presence can settle the restlessness you didn't realize you carried. We move through the shop together now without tension, without the fragile restraint that once made every glance feel like a secret. There's comfort in the routine, but also a quiet electricity, like a current just beneath the surface. And in those small, shared moments, hands brushing as we pass, a glance across a counter, laughter spilling softly over tools, I realize that this is what connection really feels like. Love, I've learned, isn't always about confessions or declarations. It's about noticing, about staying, about allowing the other to exist fully and vulnerably while you do the same. It's in the silence that follows a shared laugh, the subtle tremor in a voice you care about, the gentle warmth when hands meet without expectation. Evelyn doesn't need me to fix her past, and I don't need her to be flawless. We only need to be present, and somehow that's enough. Sometimes, I catch myself looking at her across the shop, remembering the slow pull of hesitation that once defined our every interaction, and I smile quietly. Because those moments didn't vanish. They became the foundation of something real, something we could quietly call ours without naming it aloud. If this story made you feel something, let me know in the comments. Would you want more stories like this?